So I feel like I've been introduced, but I will tell you, I am Senator Valerie Foushee, and I represent Orange and Chatham counties in the North Carolina Senate. And as you heard, I am the Democratic nominee for the 4th District for Congress, and so happy to be here.
Hello, my name is Dianne Jackson. I am a retired educator from Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools, a former teacher union president for American Federation of Teachers of North Carolina, and the role that I most embrace is a community activist for education equity.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Faison. I am an advocate for Black men and boys and also finishing a degree here at NC State. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Dudley Flood. I'm a former school teacher, grades 1 through 12. I've taught all those except kindergarten. So I know a lot about children. Former principal, a former consultant in the Department of Public Instruction, where my job was to offer technical assistance in the desegregation of the public schools in North Carolina, along with my colleague Gene Cosby, the late Gene Cosby, a former executive director for the school administrators, and most everything else I am is former, just former.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Dionne McLaughlin. I'm the Executive Director for Critical Reflections on Race and Equity. Can't hear me? Okay, get a little closer to the mic. Dr. Dionne McLaughlin, Executive Director for Critical Reflections on Race and Equity. And I'm also an Associate Professor at North Carolina Central University. I am a former high school and elementary principal, and I'm excited to be here to talk with you all today.
Thank you so much. If you will look up at the screen, we will have our other panelist, Ms. Julia Clark. And Julia, if you could please introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. My name is Julia Clark. I'm a senior at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm the 55th president of the Black Student Movement. I'm also very passionate that education is and can be a tool of liberation. And so I'm also an after-school teacher at the Chapel Hill Boys and Girls Club, and I plan to go into education policy as well as classroom teaching in the future. And I'm just really passionate about education as a whole. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And of course, it's appropriate to start with the person who has been in this game for the longest and can really inform the way that we think about the history of education policy in North Carolina. So we're going to start with you, Dr. Flood. A lot of times people talk about all of the wonderful things that you have accomplished in terms of setting the stage and really thinking about how we could integrate the schools. I don't know that a lot of people talk about the strategy, those strategy sessions. I'm really interested in what you and the late Gene Cosby and the work that you did, particularly in the rural school system, to really have people think about what a newly integrated school system would be. And also, if you would mind, what did we miss? What kind of things do we really need to think about now? I know you had great hopes for an integrated school system. So what do you think that we need to be thinking about now?
Well, let me take those in order. Excuse me. When Gene and I, first began our official work, I began my work right after getting born because I've always known that we had some problems. Largely that we had walls that divided. And our mission has always been to eliminate those walls which divide. We can't make people behave properly. But if we eliminate those walls, they don't have to climb across them or go through them. There's a lot of probability that they'll do a little better at what they do. And the other, as a teacher, I always thought if you knew better, you'd do better. I mean, you can't be a teacher unless you believe that. And the next thing that I knew for sure is that most of us lived in monolithic structures. And having done so, we had never heard a redeeming feature accorded to any different person, whoever was not in that monolithic structure. So we operated on the principle different means deficient. You're not just like me, there's something wrong with you. And so what we had to do was lessen that probability that we thought that way about each other. Now, with respect to strategies, excuse me, the one thing we were sure to do whenever we were asked to come into an environment, bad way, we didn't go anywhere we weren't invited. We didn't bust into anything. So we had an advantage. And when they asked why you're here, it's because you asked me to come. That's why I'm here. I didn't come here as your enemy. I'm not here to denigrate you. I'm not here to do anything except see if I can be a means to an end, which you've determined that you were looking for. Now, they hadn't always determined that they were looking for that, but you got to have some principle on which you begin to do what you do. The second thing we did was to model what we believed. If you're preaching one thing and modeling something else, it doesn't go very far. It might sound good in an audience, but they'll check you out pretty soon. Are you living what you preached? Are you doing what you told us we ought to do? Well, you couldn't have been around Gene Cosby and me without knowing that here's a black guy from Eastern North Carolina, a white guy from Western North Carolina, who loved each other as much as two men can love each other and still be men. You saw that in us. And so we didn't have to tell you who we are. We showed you who we were, and we lived by what we advocated. We didn't live one way and another. Then thirdly, we recognized that people had to have a different language than the one they were using. One of our problems right now is we don't all have the same language. We don't all have the same perspective on language. And sometimes when we're trying our best to be complimentary, we're being insulting. Sometimes when we're doing our best to endorse people, we're negotiating that opportunity. Let me give you just one slight example. That happened to me last week. I was in a place where everybody there except me and whoever I took with me were white. And somebody came up to one of the persons and said, "I don't see color." Well, for the persons who were with me, they said, "So what's wrong with your vision? You don't see color." That's not what I heard. That's what they heard. What I heard was, "I don't act on your race." That's different from what they heard. Their perspective was that you're being negative or denigrating, a scapegoat, or whatever. If you don't have a relationship with a person and you don't have a language with to generate that relationship, you're not going to do very well at that. So one of the things we need to be working on is a common language. What do you mean by what you said? Now, when I was able to help them understand, I know these people have been knowing him for 40 years, what he is trying to communicate to you is that he's not operating on the concept of what your race is. Some of that took, some of it they're still working on. But you have to understand this is a building process. It doesn't happen overnight. Because you said it one time does not change the narrative of a person that's been inculcated all their lives because they lived in a monolithic structure. Coming up in my hometown, Winton, population 698, as a child, I don't know that I ever heard a redeeming feature according to anybody who was not black. I don't know that I did. So how on earth would you expect me to know that there were some white people on earth who were not altogether negative as I had been taught? Watch out, son, when you can't play with that one. Now, that didn't come out of my house. It wouldn't come out of my house because my father, who was a biracial man, the son of a white man and a Native American woman, and my mother, who was black, didn't leave me anybody to hate. I didn't have anybody to hate. So, because there wasn't nobody there but whites, blacks, and American Indians. But notwithstanding me, I didn't know anybody else that didn't hate somebody. I don't now by that way. It doesn't hate somebody, or hatred doesn't manifest itself in viciousness necessarily, but in the fact that I wish you weren't where you are doing what you're doing. So you've got to work with the understanding of where our race is not all the issue. Our inculcation is the issue, our perception of how we perceive and how we formed our narrative. The last thing I'll tell you, the Civil Rights Act didn't start on equity. It started on equality. Equality is a very frightening concept to anybody because if I played a little basketball coming along, and if everybody said, Michael Jordan, you got to be equal to Dudley Flood, that'd been troubling to him. He can't grow me 6'7". He can't make me jump over the goal and dunk. But if Michael had been around me, he would know while he might be best on the team, I was best for the team. I've never been on a team of any kind that I was the best on it, but I've never been on one that I wasn't the best for it. I can do that. And so the equity issue here is greater than just equality. It is understanding that the disbursement of resources where it ought to be and to do the most good is a much more difficult proposition than just saying we're going to give everybody the same thing. We give everybody the same thing in a lot of instances. Last thing I'll give you is an example of that. I live in Raleigh. And in Raleigh, every Friday, they come by and pick up the garbage. Pick up everybody's garbage. I don't need them to come to my house. They could come once a month because I'm the only person who lives there, and I'm a fiscal conservative. If I'm gonna eat a pork chop, I buy a pork chop. If I buy two of them, eat two. I don't have any garbage. I don't throw away anything. I raise earthworms, so if it's vegetation, I feed them. I got a cat running around my way. I'm bonded, but he thinks he lives there. If it's meat, I give it to him. I got birds flying around. If it's crumbs, I give it. So I don't need a garbage collector. But I need for them to collect garbage from 2 houses down from me where 20 people live in 2 houses. That's equity. Now, what I just served them, no. A cockroach can walk 2 blocks. If they're going to have cockroaches, I'm going to have cockroaches. So it's self-serving. Now, why don't they do that? It's very complicated. Very complicated. Equality is equal, easy. Equity is very complicated. So when you start talking about, don't be superficial in your discussion of equity. You got to help people understand there has to be a system of disbursement. If it's not systemic, it's not going to happen on an individual basis. You can't have equity. We're too different, but on a systematic basis. Now, school is an eleemosynary concept. It's not designed for me. It's designed for the good that I might render if you educate me. So if you have everybody to understand that, they know what's up with this, what's good for me. Every time they say we're going to raise taxes for school, I don't have any children, haven't had any biological children. I got 50 or 60 children. But every time they say we're going to improve education, I say, what's my part? Because I want everybody to be educated. Those of you who are working, please keep doing that because I'm on Social Security. You pay my bills. And I want you to have a PhD in nuclear physics. I'm generalizing here. I'm saying to you that you have to have people know what is their gain. We are selfish by our own nature. And if I can't show you what is different and better, no need of me talking about what is different. It has to be better. And better means you're going to be served by it equally well. So I'll leave it at that. If you have further questions and there's time left, I'll be glad to address them. But that's the context under which we worked.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. And I think my next question would be for you, Dr. McLaughlin. Could you tell me how you think that America's racialized past has informed the current context, and what can we do to change the narrative?
Okay, and I think there's a PowerPoint they're putting up for me, so I'll give them a minute to put that up. It's up. Great. Thank you. And we're going to move kind of quickly through this, so I'll kind of signal to the folks in the back to continue. So you can advance. So, and you can keep going. Yeah, I think we'd like to believe that the United States is a meritocracy, right? This idea that we achieve success based on our own hard work, based on our own effort. But as we consider or examine the history of this country, ladies, you can just keep flicking and keep going. Thanks. Yeah, as we examine the history of this country, we see that this country was established to benefit one group, right, and to disadvantage another, and that these advantages or privileges took place over 200 years, right, and largely for those in the white community. Another 100 years of forced labor and false imprisonment through the convict leasing system. And the convict leasing system, essentially in the southern states, leased prisoners to large plantations, right? to private railways, and also to mines. Another 100 years also included legalized segregation. It included redlining and restrictive covenants. There were real estate steering into certain neighborhoods. And in terms of redlining, that was basically the federal government in the 1930s creating these color-coded maps to decide who was going to get higher interest rates and who was going to get financial assistance. We had racially restrictive deeds and covenants that decided or really prohibited non-white people from living in certain, purchasing certain properties and living in certain neighborhoods. So we have this 300 years of advantaging one group in this country, right, and disadvantaging another group. And so it's understandable that there may be some hesitance, right, some fear about how do we teach these topics in schools. But as difficult as it is to listen to the stories of oppression, it was infinitely more difficult to live through or experience that oppression. So we can't pretend as if this 300-year history does not have an impact on how we live our lives today. So in schools where 71% of the principals are white, 79% of the teachers are white, 53% of the students are students of color, we can't say that we're not going to teach our students about the impact of this 300-year history and how it affects them today. So we want to have opportunities to talk about racial uplift, Black excellence. We want to see excellence in the Latinx community and also in the AAPI community. Teaching all of that is part of how we teach. So how does what we know or learn about the Black experience affect how we talk about these issues of equity, of bias, racism, and privilege? What do we notice about present day relationships with Blacks and the police, right? That stemmed from that historical relationship in Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, with the race massacre that took place, the false imprisonment in the convict leasing system, that relationship with Blacks and the police through Bloody Sunday and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? Malcolm talked about we should not allow ourselves to be brutalized, right? After the 1962 murder of Ronald Stokes by by a Los Angeles police officer. And it's also what Public Enemy sang about, right? In terms of the relationship with the police. So other historical experiences in the Black community that impact how we talk about these issues of equity, bias, racism, and privilege, the experience of 4,700 lynchings in this country, and the present day issues related to nooses, current day. The historical presence of blackface and the Gucci balaclava knit top, right? Just in time for Black History Month in February 2019. The stereotypical images of Black men and Black women and also Black children, right, in the media. And the residue of 300 years of enslavement, of segregation, and white privilege. So we have state-sanctioned discrimination, where the complexion of our neighborhoods, right, there is the value of our property, as if there's a connection between the value of our property and the complexion of the people who live there, or based on the race or an ethnicity, right, of the residents, right, the value of our property. And so we have the vestiges of redlining. We have an absence of generational wealth. So that, of course, impacts our discussion on these issues, as does the issues with Karens, right? The policing of Black women, the policing of Black people by white women, living while Black incidents, where there are assumptions about what Black people can afford and where we should live or where we should be. Crimes that we're accused of. You have the power of a white woman to call the police and say that she was being attacked by a Black man simply because he was asking her to put her dog on a leash. So when we think about racial identity development, how that impacts these conversations, our experiences with racism, our experiences with privilege, those encounter experiences that we've had, our willingness or our resistance at times to work across racial and ethnic lines to have these conversations and to do this work. So in the current racial climate, and this has already been talked about earlier today, right? So school boards and legislators rallying against the so-called teaching of critical race theory in schools. And I want to share a statistic with you that over the past year, right, 200 bills have been filed in over 40 states to limit the so-called teaching of critical race theory in schools. And I want you to sit with that number for a minute. Over 200 bills filed in 40 states, right? And of course, we have HB 324 in the state of North Carolina that was vetoed by the governor. And so it's apropos that we pause to learn about and talk about history in this space. And we consider what are the opportunities that we're creating for our own discourse, but also for the discourse for our children as well. And so are we creating those opportunities for our students to learn about history when laws are currently being written to deprive them of this, right? This erasure, you can go back, this erasure, right, this refusal to acknowledge the role of our racial past. So part of the work that we do with Critical Reflections on Race and Equity Initiative is that we work with a multiracial group of middle school, high school, and upper school students to learn about the history's contributions and realities of people of color. And that's through an elective course that teaches and that centers really issues of equity, bias, racism, and privilege. And so we want to partner to create opportunities for mirrors for our students to see themselves in the curriculum, right? Windows for them to have experiences they perhaps have not had. And I know I've talked primarily about the Black experience, and if you'll give me about 45 seconds, I'm wrapping this up.
45 now.
45, I'm wrapping it up.
Okay.
But it's so important that, you can go back. I think it's so important that we talk about the anti-Asian violence and the experiences in the AAPI community as well. What do we know about the South Asian experience in growing up Daisy? There's so much to learn there. How much do we know about the US-Mexico fumigations, forced border fumigations, right? The gasoline baths or the zoot suit riots that took place in Los Angeles? How much do we know about Puerto Rico and the debate about statehood, or Ellen Ochoa, right, who was the first Latinx female astronaut? Or Arturo Schomburg, right? Arthur Schomburg, right, to most of us, right, who is an historian and a writer for whom the Schomburg Center in Harlem was named. He's a Puerto Rican, a Black Puerto Rican. Are we familiar with the Korean Wave and the role the Chinese had in the transcontinental railroad and building? And of course, we've already talked today about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And Japanese internment camps, I know you're familiar with those. Due to the perception of public danger, you had over 120,000 Japanese Americans who were forcibly removed from their homes, and 60% of them were American citizens, right? The murder of Vincent Chin in 1982, who was a Chinese American young man who was beaten to death by two white men because they thought he was Japanese, right? They were concerned about jobs being taken in the auto industry, and that's the reason he was killed. And so we have so much, and I'm wrapping up. We have so much to learn. One more slide. We have so much to learn, and I think we're not teaching in our schools, right? And part of the reason is there are few teacher education programs that adequately teach our students about these topics in schools. And my last slide. As a result, I think we change this narrative by building coalitions, right, where we have conversations and we begin to move this work forward to go from equity talk to equity execution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. Julia, I want you to know that I met this beautiful husband of mine in the audience when we were students at the North Carolina A&T State University. And you cried. We met when we were student activists in school, and our idea of what we wanted to offer to the world was making sure that this was a better place for our children, and our path was education. So I'm very proud that my husband is one of the 2% of Black males in this country who decided to go into the principalship. Julia, I'm asking because you are such a renowned activist, and I want you to know that Julia was featured, I believe it was in Sunday's edition of the Washington Post, and has done a lot of activist work. And I work a lot with, as you know, veterans of the civil rights era, and I know that things like freedom schools and notions of education really came out of a lot of political organizing. So I want to ask you, Julia, as the bright young star that you are, what is on the landscape now for young activists? What do we need to be thinking about today in connecting activism with education?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And I learned a lot about it specifically this summer, where I had the opportunity to teach fifth grade literature at a educational nonprofit program called Breakthrough Collaborative. And while I was there, I had an instructional coach that was helping me through learning classroom management techniques and et cetera. And when I sat down and spoke with her about how I really felt like education was not only essential to liberation, but is in itself a revolutionary space, she responded to me. She was like, "Oh, it's nice that you feel that way now, but once you're deeper in education, you realize that it's just an arm of the state." And that I don't agree with. And it makes me sad that that was something that she felt like was inevitable, like a conclusion I would inevitably come to through my process in education. And I think we need to look at the ways that anti-Blackness and white supremacy have embedded themselves into our education system, both nationally but also internationally. And I speak from an international standpoint as well because I'm Brazilian American. And so I was born in Brazil. All of my maternal family lives in Brazil continually. When we talk about white supremacy in education, a lot of times we speak of it within an American lens because that's what we're experiencing with. And I think that is very valid. But it's also, I think, important to look at how education and white supremacy in education and institutionalized oppression in education is something that is reciprocated and replicated globally. And that is very intentional because the Black diaspora has spread across every corner of this world. And we know that education amongst Black people, education of Black people, and education of Black history is something that is detrimentally affected in almost every single place. And so I know that for me, in terms of what I'm looking at in the future of education, is not only looking at it both nationally but internationally, but also I think within America's systems, looking at the systemic, and I call it unrequited love, that Black students have for the education system, but it's not being reciprocated. Specifically, I remember growing up in predominantly white schools, and I know that my parents moved me into those schools because of the opportunity that they would create for me. And I understand that. And I've always loved education. I always tell people I've always loved education. I was lining up my stuffed animals as a kid and teaching them the ABCs. But education, the education system has never quite loved me back. And it was very difficult coming to terms with that as a child, knowing that when I stepped into a classroom, that I was automatically perceived as unintelligent, that I was automatically perceived as a problem child, that I was automatically perceived as distracting or whatever it may be, or that the dress codes in schools were targeting Black girls specifically, or the teachers that I had. I didn't have my first Black teacher until high school, I believe. And so, this unrequited love that Black students face in education, I believe systemically pushes them away from learning as a lifelong journey and instead makes it a burden where Black students can't wait to get out of school. We can't wait to leave the academic spaces because we feel so much trauma from them in the first place. And so, I think it's both about looking at the mental health resources that we have within schools and the social services that we have within schools in how our kids are feeling within the walls. You should not have a school that feels like a prison to Black students. You shouldn't have a school that has metal detectors, that has locks on every door, where you're scared of school shootings, where you're scared of violence within the walls that are supposed to keep you safe and that are supposed to educate you. And so I think that all of these things not only create trauma within the school building, but also pushes Black students away from education and pushes Black students away from that space because they are constantly being told, whether it's subliminally or very bluntly, that they do not belong there and that they shouldn't be there. And I think even now with the Supreme Court case that is currently on file with affirmative action, it's that same rhetoric being repeated now, where Black students don't belong in schools. Black students don't belong, particularly in schools that have historically been predominantly white. And so that separation has continued to this day. Whether schools are now integrated legally and lawfully and within an institutional system from the federal government, there is still a segregation, I believe, not only in how Black students are treated when they're in schools, the resources that they're able to get both mentally and socially, but also in how people perceive what Black students deserve, that we are still seen as undeserving in a lot of these spaces. And whether that's said to us outright or whether that's said to us through microaggressions, it's something that we remember ourselves. And it makes it a lot more difficult for Black kids and specifically young Black adults to engage in an educational space that has caused them so much harm in the past. So I think right now our generation is angry. I know that my generation is angry, and we have every right to be. I truly believe that we do. But it's now about educating on how we can turn this anger into action, because it's very easy to be angry, honestly. And I think that I've fallen into that as well, where you're so angry about everything that's happening around you, whether that's the police violence, whether that's the lack of resources in your school, whether that's the lack of diversity in your curriculum and the professionals that are teaching you. But it's a lot harder to take that anger and direct it in a way that creates change, and take that pain and direct it into something that creates a passion. And so specifically in my teaching, what I really like to do is focus on social and emotional learning, because I think that that allows students that are dealing with these emotions that are far larger than themselves to be able to direct stuff like that, stuff like anger, something like pain, something like feeling unwanted or undervalued, to instead allowing that to be directed into something that creates a passion, that creates a path, and that creates a lifelong journey that is not marred by the systemic oppression that we often face within the school walls and outside as well.
Julia, thank you so much. That was nice. I guess kind of keeping on that activist train, if I had to bottle up what I think an amazing educator citizen would be, it would be Dianne Jackson, who I met in the school system. And she has been literally in these educational organizing streets for decades, putting in the work. So I guess my question for you, Ms. Jackson, is what do you think about what Julia was talking about and some of the other panelists about the systemic obstructions to organizing and educational equity advocacy?
Thanks. Let me slide up. Brian Stevenson stated that we cannot create justice without getting close to places where injustice prevails. And over the years, I have given a lot of time and thought to addressing educational obstructions as it relates to equity and also equity advocacy. In my opinion, there are three major barriers that have to be addressed. And I apologize in advance if I step on some toes in the room. The teacher preparations in our higher education institutions. According to data from the National Center for Education Statistics, 77 to 79% of North Carolina's teaching force is white, non-Hispanic, while our students of color population is increasing. And educators with limited interactions with people of different backgrounds can have limited knowledge of experiences and contributions of those outside of the dominant culture. Pre-service teachers, according to Gloria Lanson Billings, should be educated to develop a disposition to oppose inequity. Our teacher preparation program should prepare educators with principles and practices that would promote structural and institutional change to learning environments that impede the progress of students of color. Right now, that's not happening. Second was lack of value of community voice. I retired from a district where the majority of the teaching force doesn't reside in that district due to the cost of housing. So I would ask you, how connected are the teachers to the communities in which their students reside? How committed are they to the success of those communities? When the voices of parents who have predictable and equitable outcomes, the highest discipline referrals, and the largest gaps due to the interrupted learning from the pandemic aren't in the room, then decisions are being made for them, not with them. Equity advocacy is intentional. Right here in Raleigh, you have a model where that type of work is being done, a communicative responsive school. Southeast Raleigh Elementary School which partners with Southeast Raleigh Promise and the YMCA. That mission statement says that we value and actively partner with the community and our families to address the holistic needs of our students. Similar in its attention to community voice are Durham's Village of Wisdom and Durham's Children's Initiative. As I said, intentional. And the last thing that I think is a barrier is fear of change. And as one of the young ladies in another workshop said, why I need for my teachers to be brave. For the most part, educators are like missionaries. We just want to make a difference. So to call out inequities, to right some wrongs, one has to be willing to speak up, to make some waves, to be out on a limb, a lot of times possibly by yourself. Systemic and institutional change comes down to policies, practices, procedures, and people. Knowing what is easy, knowing what to do is easy, but having the will, the heart, and the courage to do it is the hard part. Thank you.
And I want to thank you for always showing up with courage. And we talk about community voices, Chris Faison. I've not seen as many young people with the agility that you have to interface with the community, particularly a community that you might not be from. And I think you do that so well. And your particular focus is Black men. Could you talk a little bit about engaging young Black men and how you move in the community to incorporate the community history to inform your work?
Thanks, Danita. And I wanted to say, seeing a classmate of mine, Dr. Tanya, in the audience, Julia, I had a chance to be a BSM president 22 years ago. So just knowing that those relationships matter, not just for myself, but for the people that are coming behind me, right? So I would say that, campuses are often awful, particularly predominantly white or historically white institutions, in engaging and respecting the communities that in which they're situated, particularly the Black communities, to be really clear. And I think that when it comes to recognizing the genius of Black boys, or the giftedness, is just encouraging that natural gifting, recognizing that their ecosystem is not only their given family, but also their chosen family. Also, the ways that we talk about gender now, being inclusive and understanding, and not just saying it, not just having pronouns on your name tag, but actually living it, right? And then just also this issue around intergenerational conversations. Danita has been such a great. She told me I was going to be her godson. I said, okay, I am, because you said I'm going to be right. So it's this idea of not just thinking that you know everything all the time, but also recognizing that. And it's not just, and I learn a lot from Julia and other activists that are younger, and recognizing that we need to have those conversations together. But when it comes to Black boys in particular, we have to censor them. We can't allow for older folks, and I know I'm one of them sometimes, to take up all the air and to wag our finger and say what I did in my day. No, let's let them have the conversation, censor them, and also make sure they're heard and they're exposed to other ways to show their giftedness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I did scoop Chris up as my godson. I get y'all kids too. I love young activists. So Senator Foushee, I think we'll leave you with the last statement today. And so we talked a little bit about the past. We talked a little bit about policy implications. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak about Leandro, why that's important, and what Leandro might mean for us. And you might have to define it just really quickly.
Thank you, Danita. And I probably don't need to define. I think most of you know that the Leandro decision was a decision that was made almost 30 years ago, resultant from a lawsuit from 5 counties in this state as it related to children of color not having access and opportunity as students in other parts of the state, and understanding that that situation was done, and then finding that it was not, that the state indeed was not providing a sound basic education for every child as the Constitution dictates. But then having to have that situation adjudicated and there being a decision that mandated that the state of North Carolina provide the funding such that there is equitable funding for students across the state, and then to have that decision challenged such that nothing is happening, and then to have a situation where research is done and then strategies to fix this situation are put in place. They've been approved. Pretty much everybody believes this is the way to go, at least to start to bring about equity in school systems. And then to have that challenge such that a judge makes the decision at a time when the state of North Carolina has a $6 billion surplus to allocate $1.7 billion just for a 2-year situation to start making those changes, to start making those improvements, and then for the legislature to challenge that. And then wait for a situation where you have a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to remove a judge that has made that decision and bring forward another situation whereby at least $785 million has been earmarked for that, and then to have the legislature to challenge it again. And so we're at a point now where nothing as it relates to funding, Leandro, nothing as it relates to funding the West Ed report, such that these districts across the state that don't have access to the same resources that other districts have, that's not happening. And at the same time, the legislature is appropriating funds for private school education, whereby they don't have to follow the same standards and they can pick and choose who they allow to come in and who they decide to educate. I say all of that because as we talk about funding, we have to also talk about policy that directs that funding. And as long as we have situations whereby we're not instituting or implementing policies that dictate that a child receives a sound basic education, regardless of that child's zip code, regardless of whether or not this child can live in this location or that location. I often think about what happens, let's say, if parents who live in a low wealth community get an opportunity to live someplace else, and they're able to uproot their families, move from this location to a district where there are greater resources. And so children have been exposed or they've had access to opportunities that the kids from the low wealth community came from. How do you think, or what do you think that playing field looks like? In many cases, because of the lack of exposure or the lack of access, they haven't been exposed to the same thing, so they come to a new district behind. And that's not fair. You should be able to move from one school district understanding that there is a standard course of study such that there are no gaps. But that's what we're not doing. And so in my advocacy as a legislator, we've been begging for our colleagues to see the need for that. But elections have consequences, y'all. And until we get a situation whereby those who are representing us are considering us, we will continue to have what we have. So the status of Leandro is where it was 30 years ago, basically. So I would just ask that in your advocacy, wherever you come from in this state, that you would make sure that your legislators are hearing you and have them to understand that they are accountable to you. And that when they beg you for their votes, then they owe something back to you. And that is the responsibility that all of us have for educating our children such that generations that come after us are able to not just sustain themselves, but to put the groundwork forward for the next generation. So thank you for the opportunity.
Did we have a good panel today, y'all? I want to thank you so much for coming. And I also certainly want to thank the organizers of this event. This is a special thing to have and a special place for folks to gather who believe in freedom. And in the words of Ella Baker, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Thank you so much for coming, and we appreciate it.
Always, 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 always.